revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your co-hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back with you.
It's always good to be back on with you, Eugene. God, I'm loving that opening. This is the second time we've played the new opening, and every time I see it, I'm very happy.
I agree. No, it's great. And it's a great job by our team putting it together in the new-ish look. It's been a couple weeks here now in terms of our various elements, as I believe they call them on the screen there. So shout out to all the Breakthrough News team for the work you do behind the scenes, so to speak, to make this show possible. And it is a lot of work, so definitely tip of the hat to you. And here we are yet again, another episode of the Freedom Side Live. We've got many, many great things to talk to you about here today. But I will say to you, first and foremost, since you are already here with us watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. So that way you can subscribe to many of the fantastic things that we have here at Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. But also, of course, make sure you hit the bell so that you get the alerts about the things that you are subscribing to, so that you do not have to search high and low, but in fact, it will be very easy to find all of the content we are putting out very regularly here at Breakthrough. And what else, Rania, should our viewers know in terms of their engagement?
Well, you can access exclusive Breakthrough News content, including the Behind the Paywall part of my show, as well as Eugene's weekly seminar, which he just had one this week on Africa, by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and becoming a patron. Highly encourage you to do so if you're able to, because we do like those who are helping make our show better and give us the resources to continue to grow, to be able to have special perks. But also, if you just like watching the live stream and you're already in YouTube, you can also support the show by donating directly in YouTube. But definitely recommend, first and foremost, becoming a patron. It does help us grow, as well as if you're watching the show, please do like it. Make sure you're already subscribed, but definitely like it. Click the like button. And of course, as usual, Eugene, I will wag my finger at our audience as the show moves forward for not liking if they haven't already. But mostly this is because obviously we like to be liked, but it also helps boost us in the algorithm. So please do that. Make sure you share the link to the show with all of your friends and family. And hopefully you're already doing that if you're a regular Breakthrough News subscriber.
Yes, I agree. I hope you are sharing it with friends, family, and perhaps even strangers. But we want to jump right into today's show. We've got a lot here for you, always, as we always do. And our lead topic here is the political issue that's been roiling the United States domestic politics over the past week, and that is the rock-solid support for apartheid in the U.S. Congress, which was once again on display after the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, responded to protesters at the liberal conference Netroots that were demanding human rights for Palestinian people be respected. She responded by, among other things, saying that Israel was a racist state. It caused a big backlash in Congress. She then basically immediately backed down. And just before President Herzog of Israel spoke at a joint session of Congress this week, there was an attempt to, they did in fact pass a resolution that essentially was saying Israel is not racist. And in the debate on that resolution, which ultimately did pass 412-9, the only Palestinian member of Congress, Representative Rashida Tlaib of the Detroit area of Michigan, spoke specifically about this idea that Israel was not a racist state, not an apartheid state. She pushed back on it, and we want to play some of her comments just briefly before we go to our first guest here.
An apartheid government. Let's take a moment just to hear Israeli government's own politician in their own words. Direct quotes, not mine. Current Prime Minister Netanyahu, on his policies towards Palestinians, quote, beat them up, not once, but repeatedly, beat them up until it's unbearable, and said that Israel must, quote, crush Palestinian hopes for a fully sovereign state. One of the former defense ministers said Palestinians are, quote, beasts, and they are not human. He's talking about people like my grandmother, Mr. Speaker. How about former Justice Minister who said they should go, as should the physical homes in which they raise the snakes. Otherwise, more little snakes will be raised there. How about another former defense minister said, quote, those who are against us, there's nothing to be done. We need to pick and axe them and cut off their heads. Another quote, there is no such thing as Palestinian people.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
At its core. Mr. Speaker, Israel's own president, who's
The gentlelady's time has expired. Does the gentleman from New York reserve or yield?
I give the gentlelady 30 seconds.
Israel's own President Herzog, who's going to come before Congress tomorrow, has long advocated against interracial marriages. Did you all know that? Do you care? He said on a news segment, look it up, when he came to America, he said, quote, encountered something that I call an actual plague. I saw my friends' children married and coupled with non-Jewish partners. Israel is an apartheid state. The government is deeply problematic in the way that they are proceeding in the structure of oppression. This year, Mr. Speaker, just like I speak up against injustices here in America, this is about speaking up
The gentlelady's
against
time has expired.
violence.
Does the gentleman from New York
Congress must
yield
stop
or reserve?
funding apartheid.
And again, that was Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, the only Palestinian American in Congress. And as we continue our discussion on this story, we are very honored to be joined by the Palestinian American political analyst, Omar Baddar. Omar, thank you so much for being with us.
Very great to be with you. Really glad to be on.
Well, we are great to have you. I mean, it feels like it doesn't need to be stated, but I think it's worth discussing. I mean, is there any debate really to be had here about whether or not Israel is in fact racist?
I mean, I think you're putting your finger exactly on how absurd this entire situation is. If you look at Israel's founding, Israel was literally built at the expense of Palestinians, driven out of their homes by the hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed in order to create a Jewish state, to privilege one group of people over another. Then you look at the law, and the law also says the right to self-determination is unique to the Jewish people. That's Israel's nation state law. Then you look at the policies in practice. In practice, Israeli policies are about driving Palestinians out of their land, destroying their homes, taking over their lands. You're actually watching ethnic cleansing happening constantly, day in and day out. You look at videos of Palestinians who are told by Israeli soldiers that they can't walk down a particular street in their own cities, in cities that Israel illegally occupies, because they are not Jewish. And then you look at reports that are documented by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and every major human rights organization, and they all say the same thing, that Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid. But then suddenly you jump to Congress and you have this bizarre demand in America that you stop believing your eyes. Stop seeing the reality that you're actually seeing right before your eyes, and it is utter and complete insanity. It is an absurd indictment of American political discourse that we live in a situation in which Israeli leaders themselves and Israeli policy that is well documented in front of everyone is screaming anti-Palestinian racism, but it's not something that you're allowed to say in the United States. That's not a recipe for having a functioning democracy in this country, in which you're not allowed to acknowledge reality. That is obviously deeply problematic to our ability to making policy that can benefit the American people, that can be moral in the way it engages with the rest of the world. These are all very, very deep problems, but there's certainly no doubt about the fact that Israel is a racist apartheid state. It's quite plain to anybody who cares to see.
Yeah, and it is wild. You're right that we're even having to have this debate in 2023 when the facts on the ground and the videos we see and all of Israel's policy, and even as Rashida Tlaib laid out in that video we just showed, all of these Israeli politicians are perfectly fine just openly stating their racism because there's no consequences for it. However, there's something very interesting happening inside the Democratic Party. And I guess we can get to that. But first, I think it's also really interesting to watch on display how, despite the fact that you do have an increasing number of Democrats in Congress, obviously particularly this handful of like squad members, progressive members, who are willing to not only boycott the upcoming speech by the Israeli president, but are willing to openly call Israel an apartheid state, which is fantastic. You also still have on display the ability of the Israel lobby to pressure members of Congress to basically shut up. I mean, that's what we saw with Representative Jayapal when she made this statement at Netroots Nation, where she calls Israel a racist state, and very swiftly had to retract the statement or at least kind of walk it back. And you saw Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL, applauding this as if she did something amazing when, behind the scenes, of course, he's part of an organization that is very quick to police members of Congress. So I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on that before we get into maybe the inside of what's happening in the Democratic Party right now.
Sure. I mean, look, many years ago, a senior official at AIPAC named Stephen Rosen had actually bragged to Jeffrey Goldberg, another pro-Israel journalist, about the fact that AIPAC, just picked up a random piece of napkin on the table and said, I can get the signatures of 70 senators on this in 24 hours. AIPAC brags about its ability to move Congress. This is not really a secret about the amount of influence that they have. And so what we're witnessing here is indeed a pretty significant display about the way not just Republicans, but Democrats still continue to cave to the power of the Israel lobby, which I have to note is largely illusory. They're still operating under the mindset that it is deeply damaging to oppose Israel's racist policies. It is deeply damaging to ever be critical of Israel, that these things are extremely costly and cannot be survived. But the reality is demonstrably not the case. You have a majority of Democrats, a quite clear majority of Democrats right now, who support restricting military funding to Israel because of Israel's violence against Palestinians and human rights violations. So it's frankly popular with the Democrats' own base to shift policy in a more progressive and commonsensical direction. But that's not where the party leadership is. And that's a very, very deep problem, is that they're still operating under this mindset of Israel right or wrong. They come from an old school mentality where Israel was less controversial than it is today due to lack of, people in the United States not being adequately informed on it. But the past couple of decades have seen tremendous progress in the extent to which the American public is awake and aware about Israel's policies and how U.S. unconditional military backing and diplomatic backing of Israel just simply doesn't make any sense and does not live up to values of democracy and freedom and human rights and all these things that the Biden administration likes to talk about. Unfortunately, the Democratic leadership just are demonstrating immense political cowardice in continuing to cave to the pressure of groups like AIPAC instead of waking up and realizing there is actually political space right now to do the right thing. We don't have that conflict that we once did between being principled and being politically viable. And the fact that there are members who are willing to say that Israel is an apartheid state openly, and the fact that they continue to get reelected is, again, a demonstration. Now, I don't want to pretend as if AIPAC does not have any influence at all. They have been able to defeat some members of Congress who are critical of Israel, but it's certainly a fight. It's no longer one-sided, and it is absolutely a fight that is worth having if we're going to be principled about the way we engage with the rest of the world. Supporting apartheid should obviously be beyond the pale, and the fact that we're not at that point yet really speaks volumes about political cowardice that we're witnessing.
No, I think that's such a great point, Omar, and I'm glad you raised it. I mean, I know a couple months ago, Gallup had the poll that roughly 50%, roughly half of Democrats said that they, sympathize more with Palestinians given the overall conflict, and we're seeing issue by issue growing support. And it's interesting to point about, the leadership too, because it almost seems, of course, quote unquote single issue groups in Congress, right? Like Israel, the sort of Israel lobby used to pride itself on that. Like kind of no matter where you were and everything else, they sort of had everyone. But it seems like almost now there's this morphing of many of the these lobbying groups, especially Democratic majority for Israel, so-called majority, with more right-wing elements within the broader Democratic sphere to take down progressive candidates across the board because of the perception, I think, that A, they will be more pro-Palestinian, but also B, I think that they will be able to gain more support for their cause from the establishment by sort of helping do their dirty work. We certainly saw this happen to Summer Lee and others who I believe skipped President Herzog's speech and I think may have actually been one of the people who voted against. But I'm just curious your thoughts about that element of it as well, how really this almost seems to have morphed into the stalking horse also for the general anti-progressive drive in Congress.
Absolutely. And you'll notice that a lot of these organizations, including the Democratic Majority for Israel, does not campaign on the issue of Israel anymore, which is quite remarkable. You'd think as an organization that is openly a single issue organization, that is what they're focused on. The fact when they lobby against progressives, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Summer Lee or anybody else, they simply do not mention Israel. And that's out of recognition of the fact that the public debate on this issue has shifted very, very drastically, that you can no longer do apologetics for apartheid and expect to gain politically from that. And so that's why they're attacking them on everything else. And it's incredibly cynical that they will lobby against Democrats on the ground that they're not adequately supportive of the Democratic establishment, in the case of Summer Lee. But then once they survive their primaries, they start supporting Republicans against the very candidates that they were accusing of not being sufficiently Democratic Party loyalists. It's all incredibly cynical, but honestly, even though it's getting more and more vicious and the amount of money that is being pumped into this campaign is growing, I see it on some level as a positive sign that the Israel lobby is panicking about the fact that they're losing control of the narrative. They're feeling this need to pump insane amounts of money, millions and millions of dollars into campaigns. And the fact that, again, their success is not guaranteed. It's a hit or miss. These are all positive signs about the fact that the Israel lobby is losing control, about the fact that the American people are far more awake and aware about these kinds of tactics, and about the fact that there is a lot of progressive energy that will not be derailed by these dirty tactics. At the end of the day, there is this implicit rule in American politics that money wins the day, and we're witnessing cases where that is actually not the case. All of these are really promising small signs of the fact that we can, in fact, if we behave in a principled way, we put our voices and our money and our energy behind people who are deeply principled and are willing to put truth before pandering, that we can actually change things and move things in a better direction.
Omar, it does seem like this issue is becoming something that, okay, yes, it remains quite bipartisan in Congress for a lot of the reasons that you've mentioned. But among the bases of the parties, I mean, if you look at the Democratic Party now, just this year, I believe it was a Gallup poll that showed that 49% of Democrats actually sympathize more with Palestinians, while 38% sympathize more with the Israelis. And of course, this when you break it down by age, the numbers are even more jarring because, of course, the younger you go, the more the vast majority of people who identify as Democrats sympathize with Palestinians. So overall, in the long term, I'm sure the Israel lobby, we know the Israel lobby is freaked out about this and they're panicking about this. As far as the Democratic Party's base is concerned, it's not sustainable to continue to maintain this kind of ardent support for Israeli apartheid when so much of the base does not only supports Palestinians more, but is increasingly passionate about this issue. Now, whether that means people are going to vote on it as like a one issue thing, that's a different story. But regardless, pressure from the base does matter when it comes to both parties. So it's increasingly becoming an issue where ultimately, it doesn't seem sustainable to have bipartisan support. You even have someone like Thomas Friedman, for example, recently in his latest column at the New York Times, using the word apartheid. Now, he's not suggesting necessarily that it needs to be dismantled, but he is noting that it is apartheid, it is bad. So, even when you've got these kinds of sort of right-wing centrist types like Thomas Friedman using the word apartheid, and clearly in the long run, you cannot sustain support for Israel among the base of the Democratic Party. What does that mean for the future of congressional politics moving forward when it comes to this issue?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And this sentiment, is partly fueled by the extent to which the Israeli government is incredibly brazen in its extremism and anti-Palestinian racism. You mentioned the fact that younger people in the United States are far more progressive than older generations on this issue and virtually every other issue. The trend in Israel is moving in the opposite direction, where unfortunately younger people in Israel are far more radical and anti-Palestinian than the older generation. But as that trend moves towards more and more extremism in Israel, that schism, that point of separation between stated U.S. progressive values and what Israel is doing, that becomes more and more jarring. And it does become much more difficult to sustain that kind of support without any question. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of issues in U.S. policy that break with popular U.S. public opinion anyway. An overwhelming majority of Americans want, taking climate change more seriously and doing something about it. And yet we see the political establishment dragging its feet in spite of that. So in a way, I do see the winds of change moving in a very positive direction on this issue. People are becoming far more aware and informed and willing to place meaningful pressure on politicians to not get away with this kind of robotic response they have to everything. Every time Israel commits a massacre against Palestinians, every U.S. politician gets in front of a podium and says Israel has the right to defend itself. They really are like broken bots. If you fed AI information about how to defend Israel, they might be able to come up with something much, much better than we're currently witnessing from American politicians. So that is becoming more jarring. It is becoming more and more transparently indefensible. But it remains to be seen at what point are we going to reach the point in which that extent to which there is separation between stated American policy and positions in the Biden administration constantly bragging about being a human rights first administration and having that inform their foreign policy, and about the insane contrast between policy in Israel and Palestine and Israel and Ukraine and Russia. When you think of the Biden administration justifying its policy in Ukraine and sending all these weapons, it's about resisting foreign occupation and invasion. And yet the policy in Israel and Palestine is literally funding the occupiers who are invading Palestinian lands with billions and billions of dollars that we are not allowed to even question. During the last presidential campaign, Biden literally took issue with the fact that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and other progressives were simply saying that maybe human rights should be a consideration and maybe we should condition U.S. military funding to Israel on Israel not using that money to violate Palestinian human rights. And that was a line too far for the Biden administration. And Biden himself said that that's an unacceptable condition to place on there. It just doesn't make any sense. The hypocrisy is way too glaring. And I think it's up to us to hold their feet to the fire and to not let them get away with that kind of hypocrisy and really put it in their face at every opportunity and make them defend the indefensible until they realize they can't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Omar, before we let you go, where can people find your work online or elsewhere?
Sure. I'm on Twitter for the most part, and I have a YouTube channel as well. Honestly, if you just search my name at Omar Baddar, you should be able to find all of my social media channels. And mostly I do videos on YouTube as well.
Right on. Palestinian American political analyst Omar Baddar, thank you for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Rania?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I know it goes to me after. Okay.
I'd like to give you the first word.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. No, I mean, I think it's so pathetic that we're still having this conversation. And sadly, we're going to be having it next year too. But I mean, the needle is moving. It's just moving very slowly. But it's only a matter of time. I mean, it's not sustainable. I mean, I've been covering this issue for a very, very long time. And, I remember during one of the highlights of like the Bernie Sanders campaign was that he was on the stage in Brooklyn debating Hillary Clinton. And it was like a big news story. Jake Tapper was panicking because Bernie Sanders said Palestinians are human beings and everyone freaked out. So it's just like sad that we're still where we're at, but it definitely is. It's a good thing that there are more and more members of Congress, as slow as it's moving, that are willing to use the word apartheid. Like that is something that could not have happened 6 or 7 years ago. So,
no, 100%.
Small victories.
Indeed. You got to take them where you can get them. We are going to turn our attention now to a very, very important issue, the nuclear saber rattling going on the Korean Peninsula and ongoing, at least possibility of intensifying conflict there in North Asia. And we are very honored to be joined here once again on the show by Joo-Hyun Park, who is a member of Notatal, and they are also the engagement editor at The Real News. Joo-Hyun, thanks so much for being back with us. Oh, you might be muted.
It has to happen at least once every episode.
Oh, it has to happen at least once. Oh, maybe it's on our end.
Do we have to fix it from our end? Yeah, it might be from our end. All right. Well,
we're going to work on this for a second. We'll come back to that. But no, I think the point you're making is very true about more members of Congress speaking out. I think Rashida Tlaib, particularly important as a Palestinian. I mean, in a way, it kind of reminds me of, I don't know, people might take me to task for this. People like Adam Clayton Powell and others, early black representatives who were, kind of the only person. And obviously, more or less, the sort of Jim Crow reality was going to go on. But by just having someone who could speak directly and boldly to the reality of racism, in the public sphere, had its own impact on sort of, loosening up the atmosphere and, opening the way for even greater push by, those on the ground and those who really matter at the end of the day, the masses of people to make change on an issue. But I think it is important. And I thought, her referencing her grandmother, for instance, like that's kind of like, yeah, what can you say to that? We know what they'll say to that, but shameful really, that this even happened. Hakeem Jeffries, who, by the way, the head of the Democrats in Congress, once paraphrased George Wallace, the segregationist, since we're talking about segregation,
so sad.
and they were supportive of Israel. Really amazing. Oh, think we have Ju Hyun back with us now. Ju Hyun.
Hey, can you hear
Can
me?
we hear you?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Okay.
Great.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Let's go,
Well,
guys.
thanks so much for joining us. And, even though it's been a little bit overshadowed now by some other news out of the peninsula we can get to, what I would consider very significant, the U.S. bringing a nuclear-armed submarine to the Republic of Korea, I think for the very first time. I mean, talk about why that's important, because I think we've become so desensitized to hearing anything about, nuclear weapons and nuclear war in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you once again for having me on. It's really great to be here with you two again. So on Tuesday, a nuclear submarine, the USS Kentucky, arrived in the port of Busan in South Korea. This is the first time a nuclear submarine has been deployed to Korea from the United States since 1981. So the first time in over 40 years. Now, this is a submarine that's capable of carrying up to 20 nuclear ballistic missiles, although it isn't carrying them presently. And it's an outcome of the Washington Declaration earlier this year between Yoon and Biden that happened during President Yoon of South Korea's visit to Washington, D.C. Now, the broader context for this is an arms race, a tit-for-tat weapons testing situation that people are probably familiar with in a bit of a shallow sense, but has really been intensifying for the last couple of years especially. Now, in the US, there's not so much widespread coverage on North Korea's military capabilities. The discussion is mostly framed around, here go those crazy Koreans again, right? But we actually need to have some understanding of how the military capabilities of the DPRK or North Korea have been advancing and what that has to do with Washington's current posture. In the last couple of years, North Korea has tested hypersonic missiles. Very recently, they showed off solid fuel ballistic weapons and also demonstrated capabilities to fire missiles from mobile platforms. All of this actually does affect the real balance of power because it makes North Korea much more capable of fending off a US attack and also breaking through US defenses around its assets in Korea and in the larger Pacific region. So what the US is doing right now is baring its teeth. What's the point of sending a nuclear submarine to Korea right now? Biden and Yoon have actually been very upfront about it. In their language, they want to flex US power to show the DPRK that the United States can, quote unquote, end the regime. And so it's important to understand that this is an escalation. This is a threat. It's true that the United States doesn't technically need a nuclear sub to physically be in Korea in order to launch a nuclear strike. But the point is more about demonstrating that it's willing to devote these kinds of assets to Korea in the first place. South Korea has been part of the US nuclear umbrella for decades, which means for a long time, there's been an agreement for the US to use nukes in Korea already. So the point of doing this now is for the US to put its money where its mouth is, to show that it's kind of serious about these commitments. But if you ask me what's really significant about this moment, besides demonstrating US aggression, besides demonstrating that leaders in Washington are very flippant about the idea of nuclear war, that they treat this as something that is not a planet-ending possibility, but just as another option that's open to them to preserve their power. What's really significant, I think, is that it shows the US does not have a viable strategy in Korea. The only solution, the only path they can think of is to escalate, to bully, to threaten over and over, hoping that one day North Korea will just give up and back down. But the fact is that this has been going on for decades, and the DPRK is not going to back down. The only path ahead is for the US to actually behave more and more barbarically, which is only going to demonstrate more and more what its actual interests are, its actual disregard for not only life and land in Korea, but the lives of pretty much everyone else on Earth. And this is especially dangerous right now because there are elements in South Korea, including the current president, who want to either develop their own nukes or have US nukes stationed in South Korea once again. And I think that is a longer term outcome we should be aware of. But if the US ever crosses that line, it will only show the world how irresponsible and reckless the United States really is when it comes to its nuclear arsenal. And I think the task that will be incumbent on us is asking, why does this country get to have so many nukes in the first place? Why do they get to set the rules of how everyone else uses their nukes? And what is a real solution towards a denuclearized and peaceful world that doesn't run through the denuclearization of the United States as well?
That's a very, very good way to put it. And the US and Japan and South Korea and their response to this recent nuclear test in the DPRK said that they were, quote, open to negotiations. But, the DPRK said that they were not interested in negotiations without some sort of unilateral steps by others. And then, of course, the Western media presents that as some sort of intransigence on the part of the North. So how do you see it?
I see it as smart negotiating, frankly. The nuclear situation in Korea didn't start yesterday. This is an issue that, depending on how you look at it, either goes back to the 1980s at the earliest, and arguably all the way back to the Korean War. So from the North Korean perspective, they've tried the route of negotiations time and time again, and they've been disappointed. Now, North Korea has always been very clear about what it would want from denuclearization talks, and that's a security guarantee, normalizing relations with the US, and more recently, either an end to or at least a partial retraction of sanctions. The US, on the other hand, has never been willing to do all that it would take to provide that. So after decades of trying, last fall, the Supreme People's Assembly, which is sort of like the North Korean Congress, passed a law declaring that the DPRK is now a nuclear state officially, and they will never again negotiate with a foreign power about their nuclear weapons. And it's important to understand that that actually doesn't mean that North Korea is walking away from the table forever. They're setting a new bar for future negotiations. To put it in popular therapy speak, North Korea is just setting boundaries, although these are much better boundaries than Jonah Hill's. Now, the ball is in the United States court. And sorry, I had to go there. So the ball is now in the U.S. court, right? The U.S. and its allies need to accept reality, which is that denuclearizing North Korea is no longer a possibility, but it is still possible to de-escalate from the present situation. Now, frankly, that will require the governments of South Korea and Japan to actually put their interests ahead of U.S. interests for once. But because as long as the United States keeps making threats, and also tries to gesture towards negotiations at the same time, it's going to only come across as hypocritical and empty, because it is. And the DPRK will be right to disregard these gestures until there are demonstrations made that this time it's more serious.
The big news that has really overtaken everything is this at least alleged defection by a U.S. soldier into North Korea. And we obviously don't really know all that much about it now. But one of the things that a lot of people have been commenting on, I've seen online, that I'd be curious your thoughts about, is how the U.S. military and government seem to be bending over backwards to avoid using the term defection. Like they feel like somehow that, for whatever reason, is like if you say that, some new Pandora's box is open. But I wonder why you think that is.
Well, I think they're a little embarrassed, and I frankly find the situation a little humorous, if I can be a little bit unprofessional maybe for a second. You have this clear situation where a U.S. soldier ran across the DMZ with full awareness of everything that would imply. And if eyewitness reports are to be believed, he allegedly was yelling, "ha, ha, ha," as he did it. Now we know that this soldier, Travis King, was actually in trouble with the U.S. military for a couple of assault charges against Korean civilians, and was also allegedly on his way to being sent back to the U.S. to face further discipline after already spending a little time in South Korean prison. Now, this looks like a pretty obvious instance of defection on its face, but U.S. media just won't say that. Instead, they're focused on how the DPRK has detained, quote unquote, Travis King, as if, Kim Jong-un personally reached across the line and grabbed him and then kidnapped him, instead of Travis King running off to them of his own free will while allegedly cackling the whole time. I actually saw a video of Nikki Haley trying to threaten Kim Jong-un over this. She said something to the effect of if you harm one hair on his head, it'll be the end of you. And I think it's clear that the U.S. is doing everything it can to spin this as an evil North Korea story instead of a story of actually indiscipline and dissatisfaction in its own military ranks, which is much more harmful from a PR standpoint for the U.S. Now, there is also another dimension to this in that this term defector is very loaded in the Korean context, because anyone who ever migrates from the DPRK for any reason is just automatically called a defector, regardless of whether or not they actually leave for political reasons. And there are several 100,000 DPRK citizens who live in China, but most of them are there for economic reasons and not necessarily political ones. And there have been interviews conducted with some of these folks where many of them actually reject the term defector because they feel like it's not an accurate description of who they are. There's also about 30,000 migrants from the DPRK in South Korea who also get lumped into this category, even though for most of them, they actually ended up there again for primarily economic reasons. And a lot of them came under the impression that they could go home someday, only to find out that wasn't true. I would really recommend for the audience here to look into the story of Kim Dong-hui, who is one of the more famous North Korean migrants who tried to go back home from South Korea and actually ended up under police investigation because of it. Now, coming back to Travis King for a second, it's hard to say, how this story is going to end, but there are a couple final details I want to point out about his case, because if it becomes undeniable that this is, in fact, a defection, I would predict that media and U.S. officials are going to start picking apart his criminal record as a way to paint him as some kind of erratic outlier. They're going to try and say like, oh, all our soldiers are happy, they don't behave this way, the alliance is strong, all these things. But the truth is, I would argue that Travis King is not that much of an outlier. He's been accused of assaulting a Korean civilian on one occasion and doing property damage to a police vehicle on another occasion. And this is reflective of an entitled mentality that's very common among U.S. soldiers in Korea because they are an occupying force. They don't respect Korean people, they don't respect Korean law, and they don't respect Korean land. And for a long, long time, U.S. soldiers were totally immune from prosecution under South Korean law. And that's only changed in the past few decades because the people of South Korea stood up and said no more. So any wrong that Travis King has done isn't a reflection on him alone. It's a reflection on the entire institution of the U.S. military and the nature of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, which is really more of a hostage situation. Now, the final wrinkle here that I would add is that Travis King is a black man. And speaking entirely from conjecture, which I don't love to do, I don't really believe that he would have been received equal treatment within the U.S. military itself. And I'm sure that there is much more to his story that we probably just can't know with the information we have, and we won't know for a long time. But I'm certain that when it does come out, it will still, again, be much more of a reflection on the U.S. military as an institution than anything else. And in the meantime, I really don't expect him to be harmed while he's in North Korean custody, because there is a history of U.S. soldiers defecting to North Korea, and there's a history of them being treated well and even permitted to go home eventually. So I have no reason to think that this case will be different, and I think that folks shouldn't allow imperialist media to make this about the DPRK doing something bad when actually it's entirely about faults and fractures that lie within the U.S. military itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ju Hyun, as always, really appreciate you joining us and helping us sort through all of these issues that aren't covered that well in the mainstream media. And just want to note again, you are a member of Notatal and the engagement editor at The Real News. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Mm-hmm. Well, important issue, and we've done a couple, I think, very important interviews with Ju Hyun that I hope people can go and check back in our archives here, because as I've said before many times, Rania, I was recently in Eritrea, the so-called North Korea of Africa, which I view as a racist statement about both North Korea and Eritrea. But, when you hear these demonization stories, there's other sides to the story. There's other elements to the story that if you really want to be informed, you've got to go looking for to find out, because what you get in the mainstream media is just not it.
And that's a good reminder to support programming like the Freedom Side, Dispatches, everything we have going on Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And for those who are watching live, please make sure that you have hit the like button. Eugene,
yes.
I see there are 201 people watching. However, only 154 have clicked the like button. That to me seems like not the same number. Math is not my best subject. However, I'm pretty sure there's quite a difference between those two numbers. So hit the like button, you guys. It helps us in the algorithm, and I will let you take it from there.
Yeah, well, it does indeed. Very well said, as always, Rania. We want to turn our attention once again to one of the biggest labor issues on the horizon in the United States, and perhaps it could end up being one of the most significant labor actions in all of U.S. history. That is the Teamsters taking on United Parcel Service and demanding fairness and fairness there at work. We are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Mr. Richard Hooker Jr., who is the principal officer for Teamsters Local 623. Mr. Hooker, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the honor is all ours. And just for those who maybe haven't heard or don't know, what are the Teamsters fighting for in this contract struggle here at UPS?
Fighting for more full-time jobs for our part-timers, livable wage for our part-timers, because part-timers make up around about 65% of UPS's total workforce. We also looking to end the harassment and the overall treatment of retaliation, hostile working environments at UPS. Also, we want to make sure that our health care is still the same, as well as strengthening our pensions. So there is a lot that we're fighting for. And I know the top is always wages, but there's a lot of underlying issues that go on at UPS that need to be fixed.
Well, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar company here. It's massive. The people at the top at UPS get paid a lot of money. So with that in mind, can you give us an idea of the sort of working conditions that people who work at UPS are dealing with and are trying to negotiate better conditions for?
So everybody knows that we had a member that died on the truck here last year because of extreme heat. The package cars have no air conditioning, and it's very hard to get any type of relief from the heat. Our warehouses are the same way. There are no air conditioners in the warehouse, only for management. And so those conditions, especially in these temperatures like they are right now, could become deadly, and it needs to be fixed. Also, UPS has a history of trying to fearmonger our members when they get hurt. They want them to work while they're hurt, don't want them to report it. And if you do report it, they want to try to discipline you for getting hurt on the job. So these conditions happen at every facility throughout this country. And again, that's some of the issues that need to be addressed in this upcoming contract.
One of the things that the Teamsters also brought to the table in bargaining this year was the need to have Martin Luther King Jr. Day honored and recognized as a holiday by UPS. Talk about why that was such an important issue to bring to bargaining.
Well, Martin Luther King is synonymous with not only civil rights, but also workers' rights. He was able to connect the two. And for us to be able to have that in our contract really is a testament to what he has done for the labor movement as well as civil rights. Listen, unions is really one of the only ways that can uplift Black and brown people, make them on equal footing. And so that was very, very historic. And again, I don't want people to think that UPS just said, okay, we'll give it to you. No, this was a fight. This was something that was long overdue. And especially since the headquarters is down in Atlanta, this should have been done a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, I'm curious if during all of this, there's been any support from politicians. I mean, obviously, I would expect at least there'd be members of Congress, at least, on the Democratic side of the aisle, which is typically at least has the sort of veneer of being pro-worker, would be lending their support. Have workers received support on this issue against UPS?
Absolutely. We had a rally this morning at our Oregon Avenue building, and it was really led by state representative here in Pennsylvania, Elizabeth Fielder, and her whole delegation came out to support. We had another rally on July the 13th, and we had a lot of support from local and state officials, the district attorney's office, city council people. So yeah, we have the attention of lawmakers and legislators, which is very important because they can help us fight corporations like UPS who like to dominate, the laws and dominate the workers. So it's very important, and it's good to see that we have their support in the struggle.
Talk about the community support you all have been getting as well, because around the country, I've seen these Teamsters practice pickets and rallies connected with them have been huge events and rallying points for a lot of people in the local area who are coming out to show support for those of you who may be out on the line, depending on how things go.
So, yeah, we've had some canvases that we've conducted over the last 2 weeks, been very, very supportive. We knocked on about 600 doors the first weekend that we've done it. A lot of more people are getting involved. People are taking pictures with the signs, saying they support us. We have a lot of support here in Philly and around the world as well. I think with the pandemic, everybody depend on the workers, especially UPS people, the delivery industry, and you can tell now they did not forget about us in our fight against corporate greed. We were there to help them get their Pampers and shoes and COVID vaccines and whatever everybody needed because we didn't have that option to stay home. Everybody called us heroes and we were essential and all these other adjectives that they want to use. But now the company wants to make it seem like we're disposable. And it is good to see that America still believes that we are essential and that we are heroes and they are supporting us in huge, huge numbers. And we appreciate that.
And I'm also curious, I think it's important to recognize that in negotiations like this, if you are able to extract concessions from UPS, this would be something that would benefit workers beyond, this particular union. So can you talk a little bit about the benefit for workers in general in negotiations like this, if it goes your way?
Well, I think everybody knows that unions benefit union workers and non-union workers. They raise the wages up for that industry, whether you work in a union or not in a union. Just imagine what could happen to the Amazon workers who do the same exact work as UPS members do. Just imagine what this could set the stage for if we win this struggle, which I know we're going to win. But just think about that Amazon worker who's paying attention to our struggle and saying, you know what, if these guys can win, so can we. If they can demand more, so can we. Because we do the exact same work and we should be demanding the exact same thing. And there will be a powerful statement because what happens when UPS workers and Amazon workers join up together? You're talking about a whole lot of workers doing the same thing, fighting corporate greed together. And that's something I think that we need to talk about more. And this will be a good starting point once this contract gets ratified, because you're going to see a demand for those Amazon workers that you've never seen before. They're going to demand more, and they do deserve more. And so this is really setting the stage for that showdown.
One of the things that you mentioned at the top that I also just want you to talk a little bit more about is the conditions for part-time workers, because UPS is shopping out all sorts of things. They've got this story they're circulating about, the guy who's supporting a family of 5 and he's a part-time worker and, all these different things, how it's the greatest job you could ever have. So talk about the issues that part-timers are facing.
Well, listen, UPS, man, they're catching a lot of heat. And they're trying their best to put that heat out, but they can't. They can talk about how the part-timers are doing this and the full-timers make that. And you know what? But the one thing they can't get away from is how they treat the part-timers, how they treat the full-timers. They treat our members like we are trash. They do. And if you notice, they don't have a video that can go against that. They always talk about how much the driver makes. When we start talking about the drivers, when we start talking about the part-timers. And when this issue of harassment, retaliation, and bullying, there's no video for that because they know they've been doing it and they've been getting away with it forever. But our members are not going to take it. So the part-time worker who constantly gets harassed, constantly has their paycheck shorted, not getting paid, told to go home so the supervisors can work. The part-timers are not having it. They are not having it. Because think about this for a minute. At the height of the pandemic, UPS raised a lot of the part-time wages because they wanted to keep them, because they knew they had to keep the part-timers working, right? So they raised it up $5-6 more an hour. And then when they felt like they didn't need them no more, they dropped it. And then they wonder why the part-timers quit. That's how they see the members. That's how they see them. They see us as playthings. They could do whatever they want to do. But I can guarantee you, of August 1st, if they still have that same mentality, they're going to find out how much profit they're going to lose. And it's all because of decisions like this and how they treat their members.
I'm curious, what can those who are watching do to help in this struggle?
Well, if we do go on strike, please come out and support the picket line. When you see a practice picket, come on out. Come on out and support, man. Honk your horn. Get involved. If you are in an area where you know the UPS facility, call them up and say, hey, you stand with the workers. Let them know that you are with the workers. You're not with corporate greed or greedy CEOs. You standing with the people who stood by you during one of the most darkest times in American history. They need to be reminded of that. And so I think what needs to happen is, if you are a customer, you need to let UPS know that you stand with the workers and you're willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that we get the contract that we demand and deserve.
Richard Hooker Jr., Principal Officer for Teamsters Local 623 in the Philadelphia area. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Anytime. It was an honor. Yes, this is shaping up to be big. Yesterday in Los Angeles, the writers, the actors, the hotel workers, and the Teamsters, and I think a few other unions all came out together in a demonstration of union power and people and workers standing side by side. And I thought it was a powerful representation because, people want to try to separate who's a worker, who's not a worker, who's this, who's that. But there you had the writers, the actors, the hotel workers, and the Teamsters, the whole gamut of them standing together in big numbers. It was great to see.
Yeah, you're always pointing out, Eugene, how the last few years have just seen like an explosion in like union activity and strikes and demands and negotiations that are ending in favor of worker struggles in various parts of the country and various industries, which is definitely always a positive thing to see. And I hope it continues to move in that direction.
No, absolutely. I definitely hope it continues to move in that direction. I think it will. I mean, we're seeing, Starbucks continuing to unionize. It's kind of under the radar now because, it's a story that the media feels they've covered and moved on from. But, hundreds of Starbucks, tens of thousands of employees have organized there. We're seeing a lot of gains, obviously, in the higher education sector. We saw recently the president of the UAW, Sean Fain, met with the president of the United States, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, to discuss the issues that they're having, the UAW. They may also be forced to go on strike because of what's happening with the auto industry, trying to gut the unionized workforce as they transition to electric vehicles and getting a lot of government money to do it. But nonetheless, we're seeing that UAW, also United Electrical Workers, making big gains on college campuses in terms of higher education workers, the WABTEC strike, locomotive workers right now in the northern part of New York. So everywhere you look, workers are standing up, they're fighting back, they're pushing back in every way. And we want to turn to another issue where workers are standing up for their rights in a state that does quite a bit to try to crush workers' rights, and that's the state of Texas. And that is the issue we're talking about specifically here. Unbelievable, just abrogation of workers' rights to water breaks and other things, even in the midst of this massive heat wave. And we are very honored to be joined here by Tavita Uhatafe, who is the first vice president of the Tarrant County Central Labor Council in Texas, Fort Worth. Stand up. Tavita, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, y'all.
Well, it's an honor to have you. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people around the country have seen maybe the headline that workers in Texas have been denied, at least legally required, water breaks. Tell us what's happening here with this issue, which seems, it just seems shocking given where we are weather-wise.
Well, it's both simple and complex. The simple thing is it's a total disregard for life and welfare of the workers who work outside, particularly in the construction industry. That is an industry in Texas, at least I know, that does have a large undocumented workforce. So this kind of bill not only attacks workers, but it attacks the people who are most likely to not say anything about it for fear of being caught up with some kind of government issue. So it's very dangerous because the people who are going to be affected the most are the ones that are most vulnerable in our communities.
You know, I was so surprised to see that as of now, it's like the requirement is every 4 hours, a 10-minute water break, which seems already insufficient, especially in the amount of or the high temperatures that we're seeing all across the world right now. But of course, particularly in places like Texas, Arizona, all these areas. So that already seems insufficient. So this would mean exactly what? Like when we're talking about workers that work in certain industries, particularly outdoors in these very high degrees of heat, what would this mean if passed for those workers in terms of the breaks they get? Do they just not get breaks?
So they're leaving it ultimately up to the employers. And so, I mean, I can elaborate on that, but we're talking about an industry where people are being exploited with low wages, or, you know, especially if they're undocumented, or that there's no way to escape the heat. They are surrounded by concrete, asphalt, sheet metal, you know, exhaust from vehicles. Like there's no way to escape the heat. So you're telling me like a 10-minute break of water is too much to ask for? In this record heat wave where we're having heat advisories well into the night, 10, 11 o'clock at night. I mean, you try to make sense of something, but then you figure that they are so out of touch in Austin. These are people who don't know what workers are experiencing outside because they're not outside. And if they cared, or if they, you know, even cared to go and stop and ask a worker how it feels to work outside in the construction trade and not be able to have a water break come September 1st, I mean, it's immoral and it's wrong. Mm-hmm. And regardless of who is the worker, nobody should have to suffer under those conditions. It should be a right to have a break, to take a water break. You know, this is going to kill people. And we are not prepared for it, but that's where it's going. And it's going to be the most vulnerable workers who are going to be the farm workers, you know, and we're going to be asking employers to take the responsibility. I worked for an employer that has a water program or hydration program, and we're still struggling with keeping people hydrated in these high temperature heats. So you can't tell me that a company that's going to have a hydration program is going to have the same concern unless people start dropping dead left and right. And then they're going to start having to hire again, because that's how it is. We are employee numbers. We are expendable under these kind of laws.
You know, I think that's a very good point, and sort of maybe the other aspect of this as well, or one of many aspects, is, I mean, this whole Death Star bill that is bringing this in, that's the name that's given to the package of laws. I mean, it seems like an amazing attack on worker political power, because they're essentially stripping the ability of workers to pass laws that help them in the places where they've been able to gain the political influence to encourage that amongst lawmakers.
Yeah, absolutely. In the city that I live in, Euless, Texas, back in 2020, we passed a fair overtime ordinance that was put on the ballot with a 72% approval by the city of Euless. This was to protect workers in our community from being forced overtime last minute, right before they were ready to clock out. So a bill like this would just kill the will of the voters. This is the voice of the voters who said that this was something that was important to the city of Euless. And it was an idea that we were going to use in other communities so that we can help other communities also protect workers from being forced overtime. This is an example of attacks, and for no reason, attacking bills that help people keep the economy running. That's it.
So I also think that this, I mean, on top of speaking to like the fact that Greg Abbott is just a heartless monster. Am I allowed to say that? I'm just going to say that. It also speaks to the fact that, like, why isn't there a law nationally about this? Like, why is this being left up to a state to even determine? And I don't know if that's a question you can really answer. I guess I would just have assumed that in a country as developed as the US, there would be water. I mean, this water breaks would be like just a part of what exists for like worker safety across the country, and not left up to this or that governor or legislator or like kooky person here or there being funded by whatever industry to make sure that workers have like zero rights whatsoever, even the right to water.
No, that's a great question. And that's a question that we all should be asking each other. Like, how in this most developed country on the history of the world, why are we still talking about what is good enough for a worker to have as far as a break? Because without our production, there is no income for anybody, whether it's the boss or the employees. So why would you want to kill off your workforce? What motivates you to take away a break, which could mean life or death, literally, especially in this kind of heat? Why would you want to hurt your workforce and then have to deal with the whole narrative of nobody wants to work, you can't find anybody? Well, you can't find anybody if you're killing them. And that's what's going on here. And you would think that the federal government would get their act together, but there is so much politics that is put into play of people's lives. And the people who are affected the most are the workers first and their families. Because nobody else is going to be most affected except for that family that's going to have a loved one who's lost, who's the main income, and now they're left to figure out, what do we do? This is a moral issue that this country needs to address.
You know, I was hoping you could also talk about how workers are organizing, standing up, and fighting back against this law and other unjust practices there in Texas. I think, you know, nationally, a lot of people just think, oh, Texas, very right-wing country. But I know that very right-wing state. But I know at a lower level, not a lower level, but, you know, beneath that headline, there's a lot of worker organizing and a lot of progressive folks who are putting shoulder to the wheel, as it were. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There are different organizations that are coming together, organizations that represent labor, people of color, the construction industry, who are calling their representatives, even though this is passed, to see if there's a way where they can have it where it's not enforced, where employees or employers are still put into a position where they have to at least give them the 10-minute break. You know, and that's going to be an ongoing conversation and discussion well into the summer, because this starts September 1st. So we still have a lot of time. Well, very little time at this point, but to kind of mitigate the total effect of the bill, we still have little time to kind of communicate and reach out to both aisles, because it's one way we can reach out to our friends, but if the majority is not hearing us, then it's all for nothing. We're wasting our time. So there's a coalition, and there's too many to name, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but there are people working behind the scenes to make sure that the smallest break that somebody can use to hydrate, that's not too much to ask. I don't think so. We need to kind of give them, like, I guess, moral help or something. I don't know, like, kind of educate them, but that's what we're going to continue to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm so curious, like, what is the argument being made by those who are proponents of this to justify it? I'm just curious, like, because I so far, a lot of the news reports I've seen they seem to recognize how inhumane and outrageous this is. So who is openly and publicly advocating for it, and what are they actually saying in their argument?
That's a good question. I'd like to ask my politicians in Austin that same question. Who is advocating for this and who is saying that this is something that's okay? Because if you're saying it's not okay, you're saying that there might be something, an issue with the means of production. Well, then if you don't have enough employees, that's an employer problem. You should not be forcing that on your current employees to pick up the slack. Maybe you need to scale back a little bit. Maybe you haven't thought about that. These are things that are very simple to us who think that it's okay to have a break, but they make it so complex. And at the end of the day, it's about making money. The less time we're sitting taking a break, the more production you're going to get out of us. And that means the bottom dollar is going to be affected positively for them. Unfortunately for us, we're going to be huffing and puffing looking for water at the end of the shift. And God forbid we even drop dead right there before we clock out.
Tavita Uhutafe, first Vice President of the Tarrant County Central Labor Council, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talk about ghoulish, Rania. Very ghoulish. And Greg Abbott, who you mentioned, by the way, he actually spoke to the issue you raised to the federal government. He said, no, all employers will still have to adhere to federal guidelines, but we don't have federal heat standards, federal heat guidelines. So there's no legal mandate. There's just, there are guidelines, I guess, but there's not like legal requirements from OSHA on heat. Believe it or not, despite the extreme heat, OSHA does not have a heat standard. So it's up to the states or the localities to make them. Now, OSHA says they're working on a heat rule, but that could literally take like a couple years. I don't know exactly why, but who knows how long it'll take, and it'll probably get challenged in court. So, and certainly these are the types of things that people want to challenge in court now because our Supreme Court is so right wing that they can, win and then set the precedent that they never have to do anything. So, ghoulish, quite frankly, given what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, it's completely shocking, and it's just something that I would sadly expect in certain places of the world, just because they're not the richest, most developed country in the world, but wow, that this is even a conversation. Of course, I'm not trying to glorify the U.S. in any way as some sort of paradise for workers. It absolutely is not, but this is just so incredibly medieval. It's quite shocking, to say the least.
No, if you follow Texas politics, they're always bragging now in the legislature, most conservative session of all time. These are the types of things that they are passing. We know also, of course, they're taking aim at pretty much anything that makes it easier for people to vote. They've actually they've made a ruling that says that the state's electrical grid, basically you can't sue it for what happened in that cold snap. People may remember a lot of people died. There's, the grid collapse, all these different things, that they can't be sued because they have sovereign immunity. So it's a privatized entity. But since it's a state, gave them the private charter to run the electrical grid, even if you die due to their negligence or hundreds of people die and millions of people lose their power, they cannot actually be held liable in a civil suit. And of course, we saw even after Uvalde, no changes whatsoever in fact, actually a loosening of the gun laws to where now you can carry unlicensed concealed carry, which has already resulted in some very tragic incidents where people, to their credit, were trying to do the right thing, but, are not trained and we're unable to do so. A young girl killed at a gas station, for instance, by a guy trying to stop a robbery. Just great state, Texas, but run by some unbelievable people.
I've only been there once, and actually that was with you, Eugene, for a conference that we went to last year. We were in Mesquite. That was my one time in Texas, and I do remember how hot it was because it was actually at this time last year.
Yes.
Maybe beginning of August. And I think it was 110 degrees outside.
Yeah,
and I
remember the power went out that one time.
And I was like, did I just bring Lebanon with me? What is going on? But also, we would walk outside. That's really hot weather, which I'm not used to weather that hot, though it was quite dry. But just to walk outside for 5 minutes was quite painful. I can't imagine working outside for 4 hours and only getting a 10-minute water break. That to me just seems that's deadly.
Yeah.
Like, and the fact that there are people who are like, no, we shouldn't even require that 10-minute water break is so insane. Like, those people should just have to be in the heat and deprived of water.
Yeah,
if that's
I
what
mean,
they're going to enforce.
I
on other
agree. I
people.
mean, they have no idea what it's really like. They don't care what it's really like. I mean, these big business people control everything. Yeah, I guess in all the state legislatures, but certainly there, I mean, it's a completely corrupt, absurd situation. They're trying to impeach the attorney general right now for being a deeply corrupt individual, but you can look into that if you care. But no, it's totally ridiculous. The fact that we have no national OSHA standard on heat is ridiculous. A couple states, California and others, have enacted new standards. But yeah, like you said, I mean, just even every 4 hours, why would you not have unlimited water breaks? I mean, given how hot it was, it just seems like it makes no sense whatsoever unless you want people to die. I mean, I hate to say this. I truly hate to say this, Rania, because it's not as if they treated people well. But I was thinking about this and contrasting this the other day with when the World Cup stadiums were being built. And, Qatar was going so far out of their way to be like, no, we're giving people these hats that spray water down, and we're doing this and we're doing that. Now, I'm not saying they did any of that. I mean, there's a lot of labor violations on how those were built. But it just says a lot when Qatar, which all Gulf states is, a massive abuser of workers' rights, seem to go more out of their way to say they're going to take care of workers in extreme heat than, essentially the Republican Party of Texas. I mean, that to me does say something.
I mean, yeah, that's a really, really good point. I mean, Greg Abbott really doing a bang-up job over there. Not even as much worker protection as in a monarchy whose country is built by essentially slave labor. And actually, that's what I was thinking of when I was hearing discussion of this, is like, you just view these people as slaves. Like, you don't want to give them water. You view them as slaves. And that's, I mean, I really don't think it's going to, it's exaggerating to say that. And it speaks also to what our guest from the Teamsters was saying in regard to the UPS issue. I mean, this issue of heat.
Yes.
He was talking about how there's no AC in certain trucks, right? And some people are like dying. There's someone who died in a truck, essentially of heat stroke.
Yeah.
And then also you're talking about in these warehouses and this extreme heat, which we're seeing like record temperatures across the US, across the world. You've got like the hottest days ever in like the history of humankind. One after another, after another, after another, after another. And you've got people working in conditions where they don't have a right to central air.
Yeah.
Or water, and it's more than one industry we're talking about here. Like, it's completely outrageous, and these decisions are being made by people who are in air-conditioned boardrooms.
Yeah, prisons in Texas also don't have any AC, and it's unclear how many deaths it's caused, but there is a 2012 study about this issue. And of course, it's more hotter now than it was then, but a 2012 study that said at least, let's put it as this, or maybe as many as about 13% of deaths in jails in the course of a year are heat related due to the summer months. And it's unclear exactly what we've seen, but I think there's about 14 people who've died of unknown causes during extreme heat in prisons in Texas. So whether or not it was heat, we don't really know exactly, but nonetheless, you can see that, and there's maybe even more than that, a couple dozen, sorry, just checking the citation there now, that have, passed away, it seems, due to extreme heat in Texas prisons, and families of prisoners are now fighting to get AC in the prison. But I think we can move on to our next story, very important story, the recent summit between the European Union and CELAC, a community of Latin American and Caribbean nations, touched on a number of issues. We'll get on that. We are very happy to be joined here as we continue the show, honored, I might say, by Manolo De Los Santos, who is the co-executive director of the People's Forum and a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Manolo, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh.
Well, we're happy to have you, but you may be muted. Thankfully, I can read lips. So I'm glad you're happy to be here.
Happy to be back on the freedom side.
Listen, it's the only side to be on. It's certainly one you've always been on. Well, the EU CELAC summit, I mean, in a way, it felt like the two sides totally talking past each other. I mean, let me just start here. Ralph Gonsalves, who is the head of CELAC right now, his speech focused heavily on the need for European countries to make reparatory justice for slavery and for colonialism. And that was treated as some sort of anachronism by the EU, who were like, why are you talking about this when Ukraine is now actually the main colonial issue on earth? But I think the more important factor here is when we talk about trade and development between Europe and Latin America, I think the message coming from Latin American nations is that reparations has a role to play in our modern day realities in terms of how these countries can move forward. And that was just totally not being recognized by anyone in Europe. But I've editorialized a little bit here. Manolo, maybe your initial thoughts about the EU CELAC summit.
Well, I think the importance of this summit, 8 years since the last one, is that the tables have changed completely. I mean, Latin America comes to this summit with much more strength, with much more political independence, and in a new multipolar era where the US and its ally, Europe, can no longer dictate to the Latin American countries as they normally have done. I mean, reparations was a major topic, but there was also the topic of the right to have trade on better terms for Latin America, of not having to bow down to the EU's very tough, but I would say, Lula called it sort of threatening habits when it comes to trade with Latin America. There was also a big question which was raised in the summit, which is that Latin America, which already declares itself as a zone of peace, does not wish to be brought into Europe's game on the question of so-called sovereignty when it comes to only talking about Ukraine.
Yeah, and I mean, there was a few other things taking place here too, as well. I mean, ahead of this very, I guess, important and historic summit, because it's been so long and so much has changed in Latin America. You also had this European Parliament, I think it was a vote or a resolution, which was condemning the Cuban government. And you had some, words said by Cuba and Venezuela ahead of the summit. How did Cuba and Venezuela play into all of this? I mean, the EU is obviously on the side of the US, constantly condemning Cuba, constantly condemning Venezuela. I mean, maybe they're not at the forefront of the blockade on Cuba, but they certainly participate in it and legitimize it. So what was the conversation around these two countries that are, have been for years completely crushed, and decades in the case of Cuba, crushed by the West?
Well, there are certain similarities, but also differences in how Cuba and Venezuela have been treated in relationship to the European Union. I mean, the the profound theme of the EU's relationship to Latin America and to Cuba and Venezuela has always been that, like Josep Borrell, the leader of the EU, said many months ago, that they continue to see Europe as the garden and everywhere else as the jungle. They continue to see Latin America as a backward, underdeveloped region that has to come to Europe to ask for resources and to be legitimized. That, in fact, the question of who is a legitimate and lawful democratic government in Latin America always depends on the EU's blessing or not. But again, the tables have changed in this summit. And in fact, the EU, when it tried essentially to create this summit and to organize the program of this summit, and what was going to be discussed both on the official heads of state side, but also in terms of the civil society meetings, Cuba said absolutely not. You can't determine that agenda on your own, and you can't determine who are the legitimate representatives of our countries in these important meetings. And I think the fact that Cuba kind of took a very strong lead, again, in a very different political context than what we were living even a couple of years ago, meant that the Europeans, in a sense, had to stand back and change their approach. In the case of Venezuela, the EU for a long time recognized Juan Guaido. They were recognizing a coup government that had no basis in reality, that had no credibility or any legitimacy other than they were there because of the dictates of the US government. And Europe, like a sad little puppy, like it does on so many issues, simply trailed behind their US masters. And yet, it was the revolutionary government of Venezuela. It was the Bolivarian government. It was represented there by Delcy, who had been blacklisted by so many European countries for several years, who had to come and represent Venezuela in this meeting. In a sense, Europe was forced to reckon whether it wanted to or not, with the reality that, again, Latin America is an independent political community with its own agenda, with its own interests, and that it's not actually willing to back down. And it was the fact that Cuba and Venezuela both stood up in this way that created a scenario in which other countries in Latin America could also stand up. I mean, Colombia with Gustavo Petro, Brazil with Lula da Silva, but many other countries of Latin America, it was clear, even small countries like Honduras, who often don't get considered or taken seriously on the international stage or by countries in Europe, came there forcefully with a clear agenda of what it means to develop our countries on fair terms without having to bow down to European economic interest.
No, I think it's a good point. I have to say I was quite amused to see Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, go so out of his way to give a warm greeting to Delcy Rodriguez. I guess a little desperate for votes in the election coming up soon here. But nonetheless, I think you're right. The tables have turned. And speaking to that, and maybe just to bring home a point you were just making, I mean, to have Ralph Gonzalez, at Comrade Ralph from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a small country, but also an ALBA member, heading up CELAC, to have Petro there, Lula, Alberto Fernandez. I mean, it really felt that part of what was on display is this renewed wave across the continent, across the Caribbean, of people's oriented, I guess, maybe is the best way to put it, governments coming into power.
No, certainly there is. I hate to call it the pink tide. I prefer the term that you use. That is, there is a surge of governments that have clearly the interests of the people on their top agenda. And we see that across the governments of Latin America, not all necessarily ideologically the same, but with clearly pro-people policies. But we also see that even right-wing governments in Latin America, because of this wave, have also been forced to take certain pro-people policies and to take certain policies that, in a foreign policy agenda that is in favor of the independence of Latin America. I think that it was clear, the fact that countries like Dominican Republic, for example, who is not well renowned for having progressive policies in any way, shape, or form, but had to take a stand also in favor of better trade policies and for actual equal development and fair development in relationship to Europe.
No, I think that's a very important issue. And one thing I always want to ask you about quickly here is a follow-up before we close, since you mentioned Dominican Republic. It's slightly off topic, but a lot of moves happening now around Haiti, an attempt to reinvade Haiti, and obviously Dominican Republic been at the forefront of trying to push that. I mean, talk about the importance of what that would mean if it did take place, another occupation of Haiti by whoever it may be.
Well, any attempt to invade Haiti, to occupy the people of Haiti, would be a direct attack and a threat to the peace of the peoples of Latin America. It would be an attempt to recolonize our region. It would be an attempt to break the back of any progressive governments or pro-people governments in the region. And it would be a clear sign that the US and its allies in Europe do not tolerate under any conditions the possibility of self-determination for the peoples of our region. Therefore, the question of Haiti is of central importance. And I think there are leaders in the region who have expressed this, who have consistently taken a position in favor of the Haitian people being able to determine their own future without foreign intervention. And that understanding that at this moment, this terrible conjuncture, the problem in Haiti is not armed gangs. That is one part of the problem, but it is not the problem. The true problem of Haiti is that the US and its allies have never allowed it to live in peace, that they have never allowed it to determine its own future, that they have never allowed it to even have the right to develop on their own terms.
I actually want to really quickly, Manolo, I just want to get your thoughts on this one thing that, goes along with everything that we're saying, and that is at the summit, there was something that made me laugh because, first of all, I was impressed that these Latin American governments were able to extract, even if it was just a few words of acknowledgement about colonial history, particularly with regard to slavery. But I just thought this was a little bit comical that it's coming up with language and like a statement about the past. Some European governments were wary of proposed language on reparations, according to certain diplomats. So the EU and CELAC had to agree on this one paragraph that acknowledged and profoundly regretted the untold suffering inflicted on millions of men, women, and children as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And sure, like those are words to be appreciated, but man, I just can't get over just how like the EU is just immediately like, no. The word reparations must be banned. We can't even discuss this. We can't bring it up. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, imagine the struggle that it's taken to even get to that paragraph as it is right now, which is incomplete, it's insufficient, and doesn't actually guarantee any actual commitments from the EU or any European, or global North power to actually make reparations and pay up for the just and fair and equal development of Latin America and the Caribbean peoples. There's no talk of that. But I do think that there is a significant political change taking place where, again, the Latin American countries in a new era where China and Russia and other countries have, in a sense, kind of shifted the geopolitical order, these countries can make demands like this. And in a sense, the European Union has to listen. They've been forced to listen. I mean, there was not one speech at this CELAC-EU summit that didn't raise the question of either reparations or the need for a major transformation of the current political order between EU and Latin America. That is major. I'm not sure if the EU is ready for another summit after this, actually. I don't know if they're ready to actually maintain the type of relationships that Latin America is proposing after a summit like this. And in fact, again, European Union, in reality being more of a colony of the United States, they will have to reassess what their foreign policy looks like in light of the fact that CELAC didn't bow down to their demands to talk about colonialism only in reference to Ukraine. The fact that Latin America did not bow down to accept unfair trade deals like Mercosur as they were being proposed. Latin America didn't bow down at all. The EU has to, in a sense, wake up and sort of recheck where is it going to go after this?
No, I think that's an incredibly important set of points. And as always, we are very honored to have you come run through these important set of points. Manolo De Los Santos of the People's Forum here in New York City, celebrating 5 years, by the way. So you can go support the People's Forum. I highly encourage that. And also a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Thanks so much for being with us, Manolo.
Thank you, Ronnie, and thank you, Eugene.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, people who haven't seen it have to go read what they were saying about Ukraine. It was racist. There's no other way to put it. I mean, you had these people who, of course, are always speaking on background, to Politico EU or the New York Times or whoever. I saw one of them sort of lambasting Alberto Fernandez and saying, well, if they care so much about colonialism, that's in the past. That's hundreds of years ago. Ukraine is a colony, blah, blah, blah. I mean, one, it's just this absurd, nonsensical, anti-communist, anti-Soviet captive nations theory promoted by these fascistic Ukrainian groups. I mean, that's part one. But, I mean, I don't know. To try to compare the history of Ukraine as a Soviet Socialist Republic and what's happening in Ukraine now to the genocide of Native Americans and the colonization of slavery in Latin America. Like, you have to be so dense not to see how offensive that is.
It's so insulting. And it's just, you know what? It makes perfect sense because we're talking about the same countries that are all wealthy and have all this luxury, not because they were able to grow food in their like bad climates with bad soil, but because they stole so much. They just looted from the global south. So of course, would you really expect these people to address or take seriously all of this, like the theft that their own wealth is built on? Like, I wouldn't. And of course, like the foundation of justifying all of that looting and pillaging is racism and, a white superiority complex. So yeah, absolutely. It's like it shouldn't be surprising that people that talk about gardens and jungles in the year 2023 are, sounding racist when it comes to making these absurd comparisons to the war in Ukraine, to their actual genocides across like literally the entire global south. Yeah, Not at all surprising whatsoever.
No, I think it's an important point that you're making. It's not surprising, but it should be one that wakes people up. I mean, that's partially my message to, American liberals, progressives, whoever you may be, flying your Ukraine flags, loving Ukraine. I mean, look, the fact that it doesn't seem to enter at all into the political conversation in America. You certainly are never going to read really about this, except in very insulting terms as well, in the New York Times and the Washington Post, that almost every country in Africa is totally opposed to this NATO war drive. They don't want to be drawn in. They're not sanctioning Russia. The same is true in West Asia. The same is true in the ASEAN countries. The same is true in East Asia. The same is true mainly in Latin America. I mean, almost every country in the world, just about, is saying they don't want to be drawn into this. They want to see peace coming. Many of them are opposing Russia. They're saying they don't think that it was good to invade, but they're saying we need to have peace. We need to move towards a different dispensation. We should not be having these sanctions that are really the root cause of a lot of the cost of living issues affecting people all around the world. And it's like that doesn't have any effect on people in the United States and Europe in terms of the mainstream consensus, the politicians and the mainstream media. It's as if, and perhaps this is the truth, that no one else actually matters. And that the only thing that matters is what comes out of Washington and Brussels. And any other thing is just people who are shills of Putin or shills of China, and they're just doing X, Y, and Z. I mean, it's embarrassing, honestly, that the considered world opinion of wanting to have peace, wanting to have more an end to these sanctions is just considered a sideshow by these imperialist countries. It's honestly shameful.
Who are in the minority, let's remember. These countries are in the minority as far as like the global population goes.
Yeah.
The vast majority of countries are, basically expressing neutrality is maybe not the right word but they're not cheering anybody on, but they certainly do not see this as their problem.
No, I know. No, you're right. I mean, sorry to cut in on you, but you see it in so many ways. I mean, this so-called ICC warrant against Putin that was obviously designed to do exactly what it's done, to sabotage the BRICS summit, because the idea of making it so that Putin can't come to South Africa because they're party to the ICC and Putin will join via video is so that now all the Western media will report that Putin's a pariah, that he's not able to travel anywhere in the world and so on and so forth. Everything they're doing is designed to embarrass and humiliate, especially African nations, for taking an independent stand here. I mean, you have Blinken go to South Africa, I think it was the end of last year, and he says, we're not telling countries to choose between countries. But then the UN ambassador, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, goes to Uganda and says, no African nation can buy anything from Russia except for fertilizer. Anything else, we're going to sanction you. I mean, you had Victoria Nuland go to Burkina Faso facing one of the greatest security crises of any country on earth, saying, well, we're going to come after you if you try to bring in Russia to help you. I mean, everything about it is it's determined to humiliate people. And that's why there's so much resentment built up against it. But the final thing I'll say on this is it'll be very interesting to see what happens at the G20 meeting later this year. India, of course, is the G20 presidency, and the Ministry of External Affairs of India has already stated that they hope to see President Putin there in person. So it'll be very interesting to see how that will play out with all of these American and European, Japanese, other officials who have been holding this anti-Russia line, how they'll react if they have to be in the same space with President Putin. But let's just leave that there for the time being. I think, as always, Rania, this will bring us to the sad moment, the end of the show. Is there anything you'd like our viewers to know before we go?
Well, I just want our viewers to know that they can become members of Breakthrough News and access exclusive content by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It helps us grow. It helps make our shows better. It helps give us a new look, which we have now on this show. So yeah, please do become a member if you are able to at patreon.com/breakthrough news.
Absolutely. Well, that will do it for us here today on the Freedom Side. Thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to everyone who watched. Thanks to everyone who has been supporting us as a patron. And shout out to the Breakthrough News team for doing everything that was needed to put this together. But for BT, I'm Eugene. She's Rania. We'll see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys.